तुझे देखते ही दिल में डरता है। तो सोडे की बोतल में फंदा तेरा मैं तेरा जबरा फाना तुझे देखते मैं तेरा जबरा मैं तो सोडे की बोतल उतना नमक
ना धराई भी सर गई
पानी ना उसमें
जो मेरे मुंह पर
कितना नमक लगे साला इरिटेटेड कैरेक्टर दे यार क्या बोले यार मैं तो सूट की बोतल तुझे मैं तो तेरा जबर जाने हट. सांसों को तेरी नजदीकियों का इत्र तू तुझे हंस के सनम से बात करती है बस ये दुआ ज़माने को बोली बस ये दुआ को बोलती है तेरी चाह
This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies.
This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Chrysler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Shashi Tharoor, who is an author, politician, and former civil servant. Currently, he is a member of the Indian Parliament representing Trivandrum, and he is chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. He previously served as Minister of State for Human Resource Development and Minister of State for External Affairs in the Government of India. During his three-decade-long career at the United Nations, he held many roles, rising to be the Undersecretary General during Kofi Annan's leadership of the organization. Dr. Tharoor is also an award-winning author of 15 books about fiction as well as nonfiction. Shashi, welcome back to Berkeley.
Thank you. Very good to be with you again, Harry. 17 years later.
Yes, time is passing. Let's talk first about looking back at your work at the UN. You served as a peacemaker, a refugee worker, and an administrator at the highest level, including serving as Undersecretary General. What did you learn in navigating those different positions?
Well, I learned a number of things, and of course one learns different lessons from different tasks one undertakes. I think refugee work, I realized, was immensely satisfying at a personal level because you were dealing with real human beings whose problems you actually had a role in resolving. I was able to put my head to the pillow at night, frequently feeling the things I'd done during the day had made a difference to real human beings' lives. Generations have grown up now, American or Canadian or French or whatever, who would not have been eligible for that status if I hadn't successfully persuaded some governments to take them, or if my office had not functioned effectively in ensuring their rescue at sea went smoothly, they were allowed to disembark, and so on and so forth. So that kind of work had its own satisfactions. Whereas if you look at something like peacekeeping work, when I was handling the Yugoslav civil wars, the multiple ones, there was a very different kind of feeling because you knew you could spend 18-hour days, and very frequently did spend 18-hour days in the office or in the field, but the blood would continue to flow. And you can't really speak of it as being satisfying when human tragedy is unfolding, except for the satisfaction of knowing that things would have been worse if the UN hadn't been there. But at the end of the day, there is a sort of intangible satisfaction of feeling you've left your smudgy thumbprints on the footnotes of the pages of history by being involved with some of the great events of your time. And as for the administrative tasks and the messaging of the United Nations, which were my responsibilities under Secretary General of what was then the UN's largest department and one which I had to reform and trim and economize on. I learned a great deal about the whole processes of management, budgeting, and human personnel relations, because you basically had to motivate people who had been fairly demotivated before that and get them excited about the mission. And at the end of the day, I feel that in some ways that, which seems the least glamorous of the exciting things that I was able to do in my career, was in some ways the most satisfying and rewarding, because I was able to shape an institution, motivate individuals, and put initiatives out on the ground that actually hadn't been tried before.
Now you are a member of Parliament, of the Indian Parliament. You represent a rural district.
It's still the capital of the state of Kerala, but only about 34% urban. I have large swathes of rural areas attached to it.
And so compare this current role to that previous role. This is more of what Lyndon Johnson used to call pressing the flesh. a little about that, because you have a central role there as a writer in preserving that identity, that Indian identity.
Right. Well, writing, I think, is indispensable. I think there's no question that literacy and creativity and the telling of stories are what makes societies distinctive and culturally enriching places to be part of. And it seems to me that just the whole business of keeping stories alive, of communicating through your literature of what matters in your society, who you are, what you want to be, what you're in the process of becoming. All of that is also part of the development narrative. I can't see development as just being about GNP tables. You know, it's also about the enriching aspects of culture. And a country like India, even in its days of the most abject poverty, had tremendous works of literature, and indeed for that matter of cinema, which by transmitting the creative genius of the Indian people to future generations, also managed to get out stories of, about, and for the culture, which will have enduring value. So all of that is very important. In certain societies, it even goes more profoundly than that. That is, in societies where there's political oppression or dictatorship, then literature plays the role of the famous parrot or canary in the mine shaft. You know that analogy. It's a very well-known one that in coal mines in the old days, when they weren't sure that there was enough oxygen at the bottom for the miners to go and work, they would lower a bird, it was either a parrot or a canary, into the bottom of the mine shaft to see if there was enough oxygen. If the bird died or came up gasping for air, then they knew it wasn't safe for the miners to go down. And in some ways, literature plays that role in oppressed societies. When literature is stifled, when writers are arrested or tortured or executed, when books are banned and suppressed, you know that there's fundamental oxygen, that the oxygen of creativity that is being stifled and suppressed in that society. And many oppressed societies produce great literature. And some of them, of course, went on to do more than produce great literature. When you think of Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, as then was, who then went on to become president of his country and of his divided country thereafter. I would say that all of this is vital, and no developing country can afford to take the view that literature or creativity are merely for the affluent and the well-off who can afford the luxury of putting their feet up and reading a good novel. On the contrary, I think it's even more urgent, more necessary, and more fundamentally connected to the real urgent demands of a developing society than of a developed one. But about the web, sorry, your question went in two directions. The second part about the web and languages. The web, of course, is not a place for literature very much, though I know there are some people who read fiction off the web. I wouldn't do it myself. But what the web is doing is certainly making information accessible in quite astonishing ways. As somebody who always did his own research for his own writing, my nonfiction books and my columns, my life has become so much easier thanks to the web. And yes, it helps me that my fluency in English means that I have access to an enormous amount of material in a language I can easily work in. That's less true of somebody whose mother tongue is Croatian or Swahili. But it's growing in every language. As I said, Chinese is close to overtaking English. But of course, Chinese is for a very specific group of people. There are very few people in other countries who use Chinese, whereas English is spoken by some people pretty much everywhere, and that's one of the big strengths and advantages of English.
India is changing, and it's going through a major transformation. And we've had at least some of the problems that the world is confronting. So what can we say about India's role in this new world of transition as it's in transition? In other words, what do you see as do you see India as a role model? And then what is that role model going to be doing in terms of the way it relates to old institutions, global institutions, new institutions, and this whole array of global problems that in some cases are not being addressed?
Well, it'll be immodest for an Indian to speak of India as a role model, but I think other countries could look at India and see a lot they can learn from. In particular, I would say the democratic management of diversity. There is no country on earth that is more diverse than India in terms of everything. I mean, there's geography, topography, climate, and all of that stuff, as well as whether it's the ethnicity of people, the colors of their skins, the languages they speak, the cuisines they eat, the clothes they wear, the scripts they use. Everything is different in every part of the country, and yet we get together. We work under a shared constitution. We work in a united polity. And we have been able to progress and transform the fortunes of most of our people over time. And I think that I see this most often when I speak to African leaders who, of course, are very grateful for everything the West or even China has done for them and regard the West and China with respect, sometimes bordering on awe. But they just don't think that they have anything in common with any of you. You are out there in some remote Olympian peak, whereas they look at India and they see a place very much like theirs. They say, here's a subcontinent which is as messy as our continent, which has as many problems, challenges, tensions, poverty, if not tribal and interethnic clashes, religious, time and time again, from African presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, in my UN days as well as subsequently when I became an Indian minister. So if they want to see India as a role model, we ought to be there for them. Some of our neighbors feel the same way. And not just neighbors in the immediate sense. We've been invited by Egypt, for example, to help run their first free elections, sending over our election commissioners and experts, because they had no experience of running a genuinely free election, and they felt that the West would come from a different tradition, whereas our long experience of 70 years of free elections was something we could share with them meaningfully. And so on and so forth. We have all of this to offer. In many ways, the Indian experience is a sort of defining principle for the 21st century world, and particularly the world that we've all been calling the developing world. Countries emerging from colonialism, from poverty, from various internal divisions and challenges. They can see a big country that has almost all of these issues multiplied by God knows how many million, that's making it work, and that's sort of learning lessons every day, and is doing so within a democratic framework. And I think that though India has been notoriously reluctant to preach its system, we don't go around saying, you know, democracy is wonderful and you should be democratic like us. We're always willing to help guide people when they want it. So we had great relations with Egypt and the non-aligned movement. We never preached them once that their dictatorship was bad and they should have a democracy. But the day they turned to us and said, help us to run a democracy, help us to have an election, we were there snapping to attention, moving on very quickly. And that's the sort of thing we're prepared to do. We've done it for other countries. We're the joint largest donor, along with the US, to the UN's Democracy Fund. But we tend not to advertise too much. You know, we'd like others to turn to us when they find it useful, and we'll be happy to be useful to them.
India was always associated during the Cold War, which is gone now, with non-alignment. But now you're talking about multi-alignment.
That's right.
That is, talk a little about that, because you say there's an interface with the role that India might undertake for its own national interests, and you make the point that its main national interest, as is China, is in transforming the economy and building up the country for the development and elimination of poverty in the country. So what does multi-alignment look like, do you think, in the future?
Well, multi-alignment is a reflection, first of all, as you rightly said, Harry, of the end of the Cold War. That was a binary era. It was either or, with us or against us, in the same formulation that John Foster Dulles and George W. Bush used to use. I mean, I think we're now looking at a very different world, where the metaphor is much more that of the World Wide Web, the interlinked and networked world where countries are connected to each other in various patterns and webs, some of which overlap and some of which don't, and each of which has a purpose that may be different from the other link or web connection. So to give you an example, I can give you several examples, but one that strikes me is how in my own country the foreign minister meets every year with her counterparts in Russia and China in something called RIC. Then she adds the Brazilians and the South Africans, and they have a meeting of the BRICS. Okay, then she subtracts the Chinese. I beg your pardon, she subtracts the Chinese and the Russians and has IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, for Southern Hemisphere cooperation. Then she adds the Chinese back again, but not the Russians, in BASIC, which is for environmental negotiations. And the amusing thing is, of course, that India is the only country that's a member of all of these groupings, and not merely because its name begins with that very convenient letter for any acronym, and that's a vowel, but also because it actually finds these mechanisms useful, it has a useful contribution to make, and it derives benefits from it. That's what I mean by multi-alignment. And you see it at the global level as well. There's India playing a very active role in the UN, but at the same time focused very heavily and strongly on the South Asian community, the SAARC organization, which is just its 7 neighbors. There's India railing against Western colonialism in the non-aligned movement and working alongside the West in the community of democracies. There's India agitating for a seat in the Security Council as a leading light of the G77, the sort of global trade union of developing countries, and simultaneously it's a member of the global management of the world economy as a member of the G20. And all of these seemingly contradictory things are also different forms of multi-alignment. So I would argue that India, in many ways, as a country, exemplifies the, I suppose, very irreverently, what we call it, the new promiscuity of world affairs. In the old days, if you were in one particular bloc, you stayed in that bloc, your loyalties were to that bloc, you did everything through that bloc, and you never ventured out from it. And non-alignment was a brave position because you refused to join either bloc. Today, multi-alignment, instead of being defensive about staying out of blocks, is being proactive about multiplying the number of blocks and groupings you can be a part of.
Let's take briefly 2 cases. One, U.S.-India relations. The U.S., the hegemon, the world hegemon that is withdrawing from the world, that seems, at least under the present administration, moving toward